Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time, the upcoming latest main entry to the Crash Bandicoot series, picks up where Crash Bandicoot Warped left off. Dr. Neo Cortex, Dr. Entropy and Uka Uka are trapped in, well, it's either a different time period, dimension or planet, and I don't think anyone is 100% sure which one. Either way, it's confirmed that Crash 4 seeks to carry on the story after the 105% completion ending of Crash 3. But of course we all know that Crash 4 isn't the only game that was supposed to follow Crash 3. Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex was the original Crash 4. But Toys for Bob have confirmed that Crash 4 is not retconning any previous entries. They're all canon, and they have even said that some of those previous entries may appear or be referenced in Crash 4 in some way. It's pretty obvious that Crash 4 is going for an alternate timeline approach. Now, to be clear, Crash as a series has never really been about the story itself, but about the gameplay and the colourful personalities of the characters, so there really isn't any reason to get upset about the concept of an alternate timeline. That being said, there have been mixed reactions to the idea. Some people don't mind it and are content with the idea, but others aren't so sure and are a bit reluctant to accept it. I'm not here to say that there is a right or wrong opinion about it, but it actually got me thinking about how the Crash Bandicoot timeline fits together, and that's what I'll be talking about today. For the longest time, I always saw the Crash Bandicoot timeline as a linear line, just a straight line, from the first game to the next game to the next game and so on. No funky branches or forks to make it an absolute mindfuck. But after thinking back on it, the timeline is actually a lot messier than I thought. I mean, it's not the most complicated timeline out there. I've heard trying to understand the Legend of Zelda timeline makes rocket science look like child's play, but even still, the Crash timeline isn't as simple as you might think. You'll understand what I mean once we get into it. So, let's get started. When it comes to plot, the original Crash Bandicoot is as simple as it gets. Crash needs to traverse the Wampa Islands to reach Cortex's castle and rescue Torna. It's as basic as it gets and as basic as it needs to be. What's important to pay attention to here, as well as the games that follow Crash 1, is the ending. Or rather, endings. You see, Crash 1 has two endings. In the normal ending, Crash commits arson and burns the castle, defeats Cortex and rescues Torna. And in the 100% ending, Crash rescues Torna without fighting Cortex. This obviously means that there were alternate timelines from the very beginning. In our first timeline, Crash rescues Torna without fighting Cortex. And that's it. The first timeline ends there. But what about Crash 2? Well, in the beginning of Crash 2, Cortex has just been defeated by Crash. His castle is burning and he falls from his hoverboard and lands in a cave where he discovers the power crystals. If Crash never fought Cortex, that means Cortex never fell and discovered the crystals, so the events of Crash 2 could never have taken place. Which means, in our first timeline, Crash rescues Torna and they live happily ever after. The end. But as I said, Crash 1 has two endings, so in our second timeline, we follow on from the arsonist ending of Crash 1, which leads into the beginning of Crash 2. So to those who are upset about Crash 4 kicking off an alternate timeline, just be aware that we've had alternate timelines since 1996. With that being said, let's follow our second timeline for a bit longer. In the same way as Crash 1, Crash 2 has two different endings, a normal ending and a 100% ending. And in the same way as Crash 1 splits our first timeline, these two endings split our second timeline. In our normal ending, Crash defeats Cortex, but Cortex escapes in the Cortex Vortex. And in our 100% ending, Crash fires Embryo's laser to destroy the Cortex Vortex. So how does this affect our timeline? Well, in the beginning of Crash 3, the remains of the Cortex Vortex crash land on the temple where Uka Uka is locked away. The impact releases Uka Uka and kicks off the events of Crash 3. Since the Cortex Vortex was never destroyed in the normal ending of Crash 2, Crash 3 doesn't happen. So our second timeline ends with the normal ending of Crash 2, which means to accommodate the 100% ending and Crash 3, we need to introduce a third timeline. But it doesn't stop there. Crash 3 also has two endings. By now you should be starting to get why the Crash Bandicoot timeline is messy. Crash 3 has a 105% ending, where Cortex, Entropy and Uka Uka are banished to somewhere, and a normal ending where they aren't. For the sake of convenience, let's say that in our third timeline, the 105% ending of Crash 3 occurs. This means that Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time occurs here. I mean, the game isn't out yet, but from everything we've seen and heard, we already know that that's the case. Since we don't know how many endings Crash 4 will have, we can't actually tell if Timeline 3 will split into more timelines, but I think such a thing is fairly likely. But what about the other Crash 4? What about the Wrath of Cortex? Well, to explain the existence of Wrath of Cortex and everything that came after it, we're going to need yet another timeline. We only just reached the end of the original trilogy and we've already branched off into 4 timelines. If that doesn't show that the chronology of Crash Bandicoot has more forks than a cutlery drawer, I don't know what will. The Wrath of Cortex is an interesting part of the timeline since its opening doesn't really fit in comfortably with either ending of Crash 3. But despite that, I think it makes more sense for Wrath of Cortex to follow on from the normal ending of Crash 3. There are a few reasons for this. First of all, it doesn't make any sense at all for Cortex, Entropy and Uka Uka to be sent to some distant time or dimension or planet or whatever it is, and then just randomly be able to come back and plan to take over the world as if nothing ever happened. Secondly, the opening of Wrath of Cortex features the 5 bosses from Crash 3, so it's obviously supposed to follow on from Crash 3 somehow, and since Crash 4 It's About Time will be following on from Crash 3's 105% completion ending, it's fair to say the Wrath of Cortex comes after Crash 3's normal ending. Following suit with the original trilogy, Wrath of Cortex also features 2 endings in almost the exact same way as Crash 3. I mean, Wrath of Cortex copied everything else from Crash 3, so it's not surprising they copied that as well. Wrath of Cortex's normal ending is perhaps the most underwhelming end to a video game in the history of all video games. Cortex gets upset that he was beaten by Crash again. And that's it. But in the 106% completion ending, something more interesting actually happens. Crunch is freed from Cortex's control, and in a fit of rage, Uka Uka basically destroys Cortex's space station. Coco helps Crash and Crunch escape the collapsing space station, while Cortex and Uka Uka end up stranded on an iceberg. Since we have another set of alternate endings, we need to introduce a 5th timeline, and to see how those endings fit in the timeline, we need to take a look at the opening of Crash Twinsanity. Well, actually, all we need to see is shown to us before we even get to the main menu. Cortex and Uka Uka wash up on Insanity Island frozen in ice, which fits in directly with the 106% completion ending of Wrath of Cortex. So our 5th timeline follows that ending into Crash Twinsanity. But what about the 4th timeline? Well, since there are no games in the series that can actually follow it, the 4th timeline has to end at the normal ending of Wrath of Cortex. You could make the argument that, with not only Wrath of Cortex but Crash 3 as well, the normal endings aren't actually endings at all, since they don't actually bring the game's stories to an end. Both of them feature Uka Uka saying that it isn't over, there are still the gems. Even so, the games treat them as endings, and so I will treat them as endings as well. So with that being said, our 4th timeline ends with the normal ending of Wrath of Cortex. Crash Twinsanity is actually the first game in the main series of Crash games that doesn't feature 2 alternate endings. The ending shows the evil twins presumably being eaten by evil Crash, and Cortex getting trapped inside Crash's brain. It only has the 1 ending regardless of completion percentage. This makes it the first game in the main series that doesn't split the timeline in the same way as the games that came before it. Because of this, our 5th timeline doesn't need to branch off. It's at this point where things get awkward. Even though Crash Twinsanity doesn't branch the timeline like the other games, its ending and the beginning of Crash of the Titans don't really make sense together. Crash of the Titans begins with Cortex approaching the trio of bandicoots announcing the beginning of his latest diabolical scheme, completely ignoring how Crash Twinsanity ended. It could be that the ending of Twinsanity was just a gag and not a canon ending, but that doesn't really make sense either. So how did Crash of the Titans and its direct sequel Crash Mind of a Mutant actually fit in? This is where the timeline gets really messy. My first train of thought brought me to the idea of Crash of the Titans being the beginning of a completely separate timeline. This would introduce a 6th timeline being totally separate from the 5 timelines we've already discussed. However, this makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, as in the opening of Crash of the Titans, Cortex says, "I'm back, babies, surrender to Cortex." What, you thought I was going to do the voice? Cortex has obviously faced off with the Bandicoots before, and his previous failures are also mentioned at other points in Crash of the Titans as well. So if it isn't brand new, it needs to somehow fit into one of our 5 timelines. Our 5th timeline doesn't really work, and the only other opening I can see is in our 4th timeline, after the normal ending of Wrath of Cortex, which also doesn't work. In the normal ending of Wrath of Cortex, Crunch remains under Cortex's control, but in all of Crash of the Titans, Crunch, even though he plays a pathetic minor role, is on the Bandicoot side, so that doesn't make sense either. So if it's not its own timeline, and it doesn't comfortably fit into any of the other timelines, where do we put Crash of the Titans and Mind of a Mutant? Where do they fit? Well, they don't. As far as I'm aware, there is absolutely no place in any of the timelines where Crash of the Titans and Mind of a Mutant actually make total sense. So as annoying and irritating as it is, the best we can do is shove these two oddball games onto the end of our 5th timeline and pretend it all makes sense, as even though it doesn't fit in nicely, it makes more sense for Crash of the Titans to follow Twinsanity than any of our other options. A disappointing conclusion, I know, but if there's a Crash Bandicoot genius out there who can explain to me how these two games fit into the timeline, I'd certainly love to hear it. So the truth about the Crash Bandicoot timeline is that, well, there are actually 5 timelines, and factoring in Crash Bandicoot 4, we could possibly end up with even more than that. If, like the original trilogy in Wrath of Cortex, Crash 4 features alternate endings, we could be looking at 6 or more timelines. If Crash 4 ends up being the game that links Crash 3 and Wrath of Cortex together, we could end up with timelines that cross over. I suppose we'll just have to wait and see where Crash 4 takes us. Also, while I'm pretty sure they aren't canon, I haven't even touched upon the spin-off and handheld games yet. I could go into how Crash Team Racing, Crash Bash, Crash Bandicoot The Huge Adventure, Crash Bandicoot 2 Entrance, Crash Nitro Kart, Crash Purple, Crash Tag Team Racing, and Crash Boom Bang fit into the timeline, but because I value my sanity, I'd rather avoid that nightmare. Oh, but I probably should emphasize, all of this timeline stuff really doesn't matter. Crash Bandicoot as a franchise isn't a huge success because of its enchanting, complex and intricate story, it's a success because of the gameplay, the visuals and the colourful personalities of the characters. And while it would be nice, having a logical, coherent timeline isn't really a big deal. Even so, for a series of games as simplistic as Crash Bandicoot, they couldn't have made the timeline any more complicated if they tried.